Hi, I'm Richard Denton. This is the fourth in a series of 8 talks on science, Christian faith, and the days of creation, approaches to reconciliation. And today I'm going to sketch out 3 approaches to science and creationism, and present some suggestions that a simple literal understanding of the Bible is not always adequate. So the first of the 3 approaches is called young Earth creationism. Now, the young Earth creationists would argue that science can't tell us about origins since origins are not repeatable. Nevertheless, they do argue that some evidence is in favor of their views. Progressive creationism believes that modern science, or at least some of it, is consistent with the Genesis account, and science helps us interpret the Bible as concerns the physical world. Evolutionary creationism takes the point of view that the Bible is not teaching us science at all. From this point of view, God communicated spiritual truths to ancient people using an ancient view of the world, which is not necessarily compatible with modern science. So, as examples of these 3 approaches, I'd like to use Ken Ham, who represents Answers in Genesis for Young Earth Creationism, Hugh Ross, who represents the organization Reasons to Believe for Progressive Creationism, and Francis Collins, who founded the organization BioLogos. He's no longer the leader because he's now the head of NIH, and you can't be head of another organization. But he did found that organization as an example of evolutionary creationism. Now, there are a number of different approaches to science and the Bible, so these are not the only approaches, but they are representative. So in these 3 approaches, you can consider a scale, and this arrow shows that as we go from the left to the right, it's showing us the extent to which modern science influences the interpretation of Bible passages as they relate to science. And in the interest of full disclosure, I am here. So I'm willing to consider some aspects of progressive creationism, but mostly I favor the evolutionary creationism point of view. So now, is young Earth creationism the only way to faithfully interpret the Bible? So we're going to consider 2 things. First, we're going to consider in this talk some evidence that the Bible might need to be interpreted differently to be consistent with science. In the next talk, I'll consider, and that might lead you to consider progressive creationism. In the next talk, I will present some evidence that the Bible presents spiritual truths in the context of ancient science, and that might lead you to consider evolutionary creationism. But now, as I mentioned, I'm going to consider evidence in Genesis that we might need to revise our interpretation from a straightforward or literal interpretation. So consider the description of day 1 in Genesis. It says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. In day 4, it says, God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. So these are clearly the sun as the greater light and the moon as the lesser light. Now, the problem in the first day of creation is it says there was evening and there was morning the first day. But the whole concept of day is associated with the sun rising and the sun setting. And we may have the concept of 24 hours time, but at that time it was integrally connected to the concept of the sun's motion through the sky. And how can you have an evening and a morning without there being the sun? So people sometimes say that that the day was used here in just the temporal sense, but then they have to figuratively interpret evening and morning during the first day in order to lead to what they think is a literal interpretation of this passage. So what does Hugh Ross say about this? Hugh Ross, who represents progressive creationism, interprets the word day as an age or an epoch. Considers Hebrews 4 through 10. It says, "On the seventh day God rested from all his work." It still remains that some will enter that rest. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. So you see, the idea being presented here is that we are still in the seventh day of creation. It says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So in this sense, the seventh day of creation is an age. So how does he interpret the fourth day then when it says the creation of the sun and moon? He interprets it as during the fourth day, the atmosphere, which previously had been very thick, so you couldn't see through it, becomes transparent. So during the fourth day, you can see the sun and the moon. So from Hugh Ross's point of view, Genesis is describing the observations, what it looks like happens. There are other issues in the Bible that might lead you to consider progressive creationism. One thing is Cain, after being sent out away from his family, he says to God, "This punishment is too great. Everyone who sees me will kill me." And you might wonder, who are those other people that Cain is worrying about? So it might mean that maybe there are some other people. So maybe the Bible is giving us hints about other things going on that aren't described. Also suggestive, although Hugh Ross does not accept evolution, are certain passages in Genesis that might suggest some kind of process for creation. It says, "Let the land produce vegetation. Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds." So, some things about these approaches. Faithful Christians have differing views on how the scriptures relate to origins. We presented some evidence from Genesis 1 that the text might need to be interpreted in a not totally straightforward way in order to achieve internal consistency. In order to interpret day one of Genesis as talking about an evening and a morning, there has to be the sun. So this could support a progressive creation model. In the next talk, I will consider evidence that Genesis 1 might not be communicating science, or at least modern science, at all. So thank you for listening today.